Hello. Here is the story behind the story of Charlie's Monument. Blaine Jorgensen was a seminary teacher, and back in 1974, he had a group of seminary students who seemed to have very low self-esteem, and he worked with them throughout the year and didn't seem like he was having a lot of success helping them improve their self-esteem, and he was depressed about it and feeling very ineffective. And he said he had prayed much about the problem, and he was talking to his wife about it. And he did so, prayed again that evening. And when he retired for several hours, he tossed and turned. And finally, he rose at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to seminary. Once there, I tried to prepare a lesson, but I couldn't. So I spent the remainder of the morning on my knees pleading for help. By 8:30, when my first class started, I not only had not received any answers, but neither did I have a lesson prepared, which was a dangerous situation for that particular class. After the devotional, I arose, fully intending to open the class to a general discussion of theological principles. But when I began speaking, instead of hearing what I intended to say, I heard myself uttering the words, "Charlie's mother, when she first saw her tiny boy, held him close and cried just a tiny bit." It is difficult to describe the feelings I had then, and equally difficult to describe the experience itself. As the story of a little crippled boy unfolded, I found myself listening as intently as any of my students, and I vividly recall the emotions and tears we all shared at each new development in his life. The story ended just as the class period did, but no one moved. We all seemed to feel that we had shared a very unusual and special hour together. In the days and weeks that followed, I could see that there had indeed been a change in the attitude of the students. Throughout that day, I related the story to all my classes. And when school ended, I ran to my office, limbered up my 3 typing fingers, and went to work typing out what I had learned. I then made a copy and sent it to my brother, Brenton, who was teaching seminary in Arizona. He read it to his classes and had similar experiences with his students. And so we determined to use it each year as our special lesson. But word of the story spread. One evening, I was visiting with a lady about the story, and she suggested that I make a book of it. Because my father, Gail Jorgensen, had challenged me to write a book one day that contained something of substance, the woman's suggestion intrigued me. The trouble was, the story was too short for a book, and I couldn't imagine how to change it, though I tried unsuccessfully several times to lengthen it. Then one night, just as I was going to bed, an idea came. I grabbed my pencil and a pad of paper and commenced writing. At 7:15 the next morning, I was finished. So I was writing all night long. My wife typed the expanded version, and with great expectations, I mailed it to an Eastern publisher. By 1976, I had repeated the process over 20 times, each time with a similar result. Thanks, but no thanks. The story is too short, or too this or that, or not enough of this or that. All I had for my efforts was an impressive stack of rejection slips and 2 dog-eared copies of the story. Totally discouraged, I quit trying to find a publisher. A few weeks later, I was sitting in my office when I had a very strong impression to take the manuscript to Ricks College Press. Remember, BYU, Idaho used to be called Ricks College. Without too much hesitation, I did so. Persuaded the press to store the manuscript for me, and I returned to seminary. A week later, school ended, and I took my family on a short trip. The morning after we returned, the Teton Dam broke. The next time I saw the seminary site, the building and all its contents had been destroyed by water and mud. Our home was also flooded, and several weeks passed before I happened to think of my manuscript sitting high and dry at the college. As I recalled why I had taken it to the college, and as I contemplated the fact that all else I owned was ruined, I felt certain that that manuscript had been preserved for a reason. So the next day, I went to the college press and asked them to print 200 copies of Charlie's Monument. They laughed and told me they wouldn't do less than 1,000 at the unit price I wanted. I gulped, told them to proceed, and wondered what I would ever do with 1,000 books. One day, I told my dad that I was having Charlie's Monument published. It was being typeset at the time. He asked me why I didn't use the real names of the people since I was going to print it. Surprised, I asked what he meant. Your grandparents, he replied. That is the story of your grandparents. Somewhat taken aback, I considered Dad's statement and for the first time realized that my story was indeed similar to theirs. Grandfather, whom I remembered very little about, had been born crippled, though not quite so severely as Charlie. That was enough for me. Hastily, I called the press and asked them to change the names, which they willingly did. The woman became Nellie, my grandmother's name. They had already printed the cover, however, so it was too late to change Charlie's name. The book, a little yellow paperback, came out in November 1976, and the first printing was sold out within a few days. I ordered another 2,000, hardcover this time, and they were gone by Christmas. So then I ordered more. Meanwhile, Brenton had written a manuscript which had been accepted for publication by Bookcraft. One day, he took a copy of Charlie's Monument to them and suggested that they reconsider it. They did so, repented of their previous decision, took over publication rights, and the book has continued from there. This, however, is not the end of the story. In January 1978, Dad and I were in Sanpete County, Utah, visiting with an older man about area folklore. During the conversation, he and Dad casually began to discuss my grandfather, and this gentleman asked if we had ever heard why grandfather had quit school. Surprised, I shook my head. I didn't even know he had quit school. I was then told a fascinating story. One day when grandfather was in the 3rd grade, his teacher became angry over something, called him a freak, and made him stand on his bad leg in the corner all day. When that day ended, grandfather walked out of the schoolroom door and never returned. The incident was indeed sad, but what made my head reel was the remarkable similarity between my grandfather's experience and what I had written about Charlie. A little later, as we were leaving, the old gentleman asked if we knew about the rock monuments grandfather had built on the mountaintops in the area. Neither of us did, and almost hesitantly, fearing for some reason what I felt certain I was going to hear, I asked if he happened to know why grandfather had built them. Sure, he said. He told me once he built them so folks would know that he had been there. Again, the similarities were staggering, and so literally was I. As we rode home, Dad and I talked about my grandparents, and I made a mental list of the similarities between their lives and the lives of Charlie and Nellie in my story. Both grandmother and Nellie were ridiculed and later ostracized for marrying a cripple. 2 of my grandparents' children, a boy and a girl, died. The boy died at birth, and the girl passed away at a very young age, as Charlie and Nellie's children had died in the story. Both my grandfather and Charlie struggled with the problem of low self-esteem, each feeling that because he was not physically whole, neither could he be wholly a man. They both lived their lives in the mountains. Neither achieved worldly recognition. Both were lonely, and both in their loneliness did little things for people to show they cared. Finally, there was the fact that both were crippled. Both were called freaks by their school teachers before quitting school, and both built rock monuments so people would one day know that they had existed. In the early summer of 1978, I received a call from a man asking how much of the story was true. I told him what I knew and asked why he wanted to know. He then told me of a large rock monument on top of a mountain above his ranch in Sanpete County. After some hasty arrangements the next morning, he and I rode to the monument on horses. How can I describe my feelings as I dismounted and examined the monument? A man's effort to tell others that he had once been alive. In the area were aspen trees upon which was carved grandfather's brand, the quarter circle Y, and so I knew he had indeed been there. Of course, it is simply speculation as to whether he built that exact monument, but it is possible that he did. He was there as a sheep herder and certainly could have. Now I sit back and consider. The list of similarities between my grandfather and Charlie is impressive, and to me it seems to go far beyond coincidence. More than ever, I am convinced that I myself did not write the story of Charlie's monument. Rather, it was given to me. I wonder if perhaps grandfather, who lived and died thinking of himself as a total failure, a man good for nothing but herding sheep and building rock monuments, might not have been allowed to work through his grandson in sharing his life, sharing so that others might learn the vital lessons about self-esteem, which he had never learned during mortality. Could it be? I think so. I think that is a good story to help us to realize that we are all of great worth, no matter what our physical limitations may be, mental limitations, whatever. We are of worth, and Heavenly Father loves us, and our families love us. And I hope you know that Grandma loves you.